the crystal goblet shattered against marble flooring, wine spreading like spilled blood across white stone. Madame Evangeline Rousseau collapsed beside it, her anniversary gown pooling around her convulsing body, while 23 guests watched in horrified silence from the grand ballroom of Magnolia Heights Plantation. This is the story of how one enslaved girl's calculated revenge transformed a celebration into a funeral and sent shockwaves through antebellum Louisiana that are still whispered about today. Dinah stood motionless in the doorway between kitchen and ballroom, her hands folded over her starched apron, watching the chaos unfold with eyes that revealed nothing. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck 9:47 in the evening on September 15, 1852. The scent of gardenias from the estate's prized gardens mixed with the acrid smell of fear sweat and something else, a bitter almond tang that only Dinah recognized. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of Louisiana history, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in parish records for over a century and a half. The Rousseau Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of sugarcane fields along the Mississippi River, 20 miles south of Baton Rouge. Master Henri Rousseau had built his fortune on sugar and suffering, while his wife Evangeline ruled the household staff with what she called Christian discipline. Tonight marked their 15th wedding anniversary, and the cream of Louisiana society had gathered to celebrate a union built on the backs of 112 enslaved souls. Dinah had been purchased at a New Orleans slave market when she was barely 12, torn from her mother's arms and brought to Magnolia Heights to serve in the big house. For 6 years, she had endured Evangeline's particular brand of cruelty, the scalding bathwater that left permanent scars on her arms, the starvation punishments that lasted days, the public humiliations designed to break her spirit. But spirits, like bones, sometimes heal stronger at the break. "Someone fetch Dr. Bergeron immediately," Henri Rousseau commanded, his voice cracking as he knelt beside his wife's writhing form. But Dinah had already disappeared into the shadows of the servant corridors, her work complete. The mysterious powder she had slipped into Evangeline's wine had been months in the making, gathered from plants that grew wild in the bayou, processed in the darkness of her quarters, using knowledge passed down from her grandmother, a woman who had known the old ways before the ships brought her across the water. Knowledge that slaveholders feared most, the understanding that the powerless always found ways to reclaim power. What would you have done, standing in that doorway, watching your tormentor suffer as she had made you suffer? Would you have called for help, or would you have savored the sight of justice finally served on fine china? Power flows through poison's veins. As Evangeline's convulsions intensified, the assembled guests backed away in terror, their silk gowns and tailored coats suddenly seeming like costumes in a macabre theater. The anniversary waltz had transformed into a dance of death, and somewhere in the servant quarters, Dinah was washing the bitter taste of revenge from her fingertips, knowing that by morning, everything would change. But the death of Evangeline Rousseau was only the beginning of a mystery that would consume Magnolia Heights and reveal the careful network of resistance operating beneath the veneer of plantation gentility. Dr. Antoine Bergeron's leather medical bag struck the marble steps with a hollow thud as he rushed through the front doors of Magnolia Heights. The acrid smell of fear sweat hung heavy in the humid September air, while Spanish moss whispered against tall windows like mourners at a wake. The physician's arrival came too late to save Evangeline Rousseau, but just in time to witness something far more disturbing than death itself. Bergeron found the mistress of Magnolia Heights sprawled across Persian rugs worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, her body contorted in the unmistakable posture of poisoned victims. Foam had dried at the corners of her mouth, and her fingernails bore the telltale blue tinge of cyanide exposure. But it was the reaction of the household staff that chilled him more than the corpse. They stood in perfect formation along the ballroom's periphery. 12 house servants arranged like chess pieces, their faces masks of practiced grief. Yet Bergeron, who had attended countless deathbeds across Louisiana parishes, noticed what the panicked guests had missed. Not one tear fell from those dark eyes watching their mistress's final moments. From Dr. Bergeron's private journal, September 16, 1852, the slaves showed no genuine distress at Madame Rousseau's passing. Their mourning appeared rehearsed, as if they had anticipated this very scene. The investigation began before dawn. Sheriff Claude Thibodeau arrived with 2 deputies and a grim understanding of what plantation poisonings meant for the entire parish. Word traveled fast along the river parishes. When masters died mysteriously, slave revolts often followed. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion still haunted every white household, from New Orleans to Shreveport. But Dinah had vanished like morning mist over the bayou. Her quarters stood empty except for a straw mattress and the lingering scent of bitter almonds. No clothes, no personal belongings, no trace of the girl who had served in the Rousseau household for 6 brutal years. The other servants claimed ignorance with the fluid ease of people who had spent lifetimes perfecting strategic blindness. She left yesterday morning, claimed Celeste, the head cook whose scarred hands testified to years of Evangeline's discipline. Said she had permission to visit her sick aunt in Plaquemine Parish. The lie flowed smooth as honey, but Sheriff Thibodeau had been hunting runaway slaves for 15 years. He knew deception when he heard it. More troubling still, he recognized the sophisticated planning behind Evangeline's murder. This wasn't the desperate act of a broken slave. It was calculated revenge executed with chilling precision. Revenge tastes bitter going down. Henri Rousseau paced the study where slave bills of sale hung framed like hunting trophies, his composure cracking with each unanswered question. His wife lay dead. His servants concealed secrets. And somewhere in the Louisiana wilderness, a slave girl carried knowledge that could destroy the very foundation of plantation society. What the sheriff didn't yet understand was that Dinah's escape had been years in the making, supported by a network that stretched from the sugar fields to the free-colored community of New Orleans. But finding that network would require uncovering secrets that powerful men preferred to keep buried, secrets about what really happened in the slave quarters when the big house slept. The cypress swamp stretched endlessly in all directions, its black water reflecting nothing but shadows and Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds. The sound of bloodhounds baying echoed across the wetlands, while the humid air carried the scent of decay and desperation in equal measure. Dinah crouched chest-deep in murky water, her breath coming in silent gasps as the search party passed within 50 yards of her hiding place. Sheriff Thibodeau had mobilized every available man in West Baton Rouge Parish, offering a reward of $300 for Dinah's capture, more money than most farmers saw in 2 years. Professional slave catchers arrived from as far away as Mississippi, bringing their trained dogs in iron determination. But what they didn't understand was that Dinah had never planned to run alone. The Underground Railroad operated differently in Louisiana than in border states. Here, geography was both ally and enemy. The maze of bayous and swampland could hide a fugitive for months, but the same waters that concealed also killed. Cottonmouths and alligators claimed more runaway slaves than bounty hunters ever would. But Marie Laveau's network ran deeper than the roots of ancient cypress trees. The famous voodoo priestess of New Orleans had built a resistance operation that stretched from the French Quarter to the furthest sugar plantation. Free people of color, sympathetic whites, and enslaved house servants formed an invisible web of safe houses and signal systems. Dinah's escape had been orchestrated months in advance, triggered by a simple, coded message delivered during Sunday market in Baton Rouge. From the diary of Father Miguel Santos, September 20th, 1852. A young colored woman sought sanctuary in our church this morning. She spoke of terrible wrongs and divine justice. I cannot turn away one who seeks God's protection, regardless of what the law demands. 3 days after Evangeline's death, Dinah sat in the hidden basement of St. Joseph's Catholic Church, her hands finally steady after 72 hours of running. Father Santos, a Spanish priest whose sympathies lay with the oppressed rather than their oppressors, had been sheltering fugitives for nearly a decade. His church sat on the edge of Baton Rouge's free-colored district, where escaped slaves could disappear among the community of gens de couleur libre. But Dinah's case presented unique dangers. Unlike other runaways fleeing brutal treatment, she carried the blood of her mistress on her conscience. Every lawman in Louisiana would be hunting her, and the penalty for slave rebellion was death, by hanging a public spectacle designed to terrorize any others who might consider following her path. The priest studied the young woman's scarred arms, evidence of years of systematic torture that would never see a courtroom. In Louisiana law, slaves were property, not people. Evangeline Rousseau could have killed Dinah without legal consequence, but Dinah's self-defense was classified as murder. "What poison did you use?" Father Santos asked quietly, his confession booth training making him skilled at drawing out secrets. Dinah's response revealed the sophisticated knowledge that terrified slaveholders most. She described gathering oleander flowers during her rare moments of freedom, drying and grinding them in her quarters under cover of darkness. The cardiac glycosides in the beautiful pink blossoms could stop a heart within hours, leaving symptoms that mimic natural disease if the dosage was calculated correctly. But knowledge like this didn't develop in isolation. Someone had taught Dinah the deadly arts of botanical chemistry, and that teacher remained at large. Freedom grows in poisoned soil. As search parties scoured the bayous and rewards climbed higher, a more disturbing truth emerged. Dinah wasn't the first enslaved person to strike back against the Rousseau family. 3 years earlier, a field hand named Baptiste had died under suspicious circumstances after attempting to defend his daughter from Henri's advances. 2 house servants had suffered mysterious accidents after minor infractions against Evangeline's rigid rules. The plantation that seemed so orderly from the outside concealed a network of resistance, revenge, and carefully planned retribution. And somewhere in that network was the person who had taught a 12-year-old girl how to transform flowers into weapons. A teacher whose identity would shake Louisiana society to its foundations. The iron gates of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 creaked open at midnight, their rusted hinges singing a funeral dirge into the thick New Orleans air. Candle flames danced against whitewashed tombs, while the scent of graveyard dirt mixed with burning sage and something darker, the metallic tang of blood offerings left for spirits who demanded payment. Marie Laveau moved through the cemetery like a queen surveying her kingdom, her 7-knotted handkerchief and snakeskin belt marking her as the most powerful woman in Louisiana, slave or free. What Sheriff Thibodeau and his manhunters failed to understand was that Dinah's education in poison had begun not in the bayous, but in the back rooms of Marie Laveau's house on Street Ann Street. The voodoo priestess had been recruiting and training enslaved house servants for over a decade, teaching them skills that transformed kitchen maids into instruments of revolution. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, September 21, 1852. Authorities warn against the growing influence of voodoo practices among the slave population. Recent incidents suggest organized resistance using traditional African knowledge. The network operated with military precision. Marie Laveau identified promising candidates during the Sunday gatherings at Congo Square, where enslaved people from across the region came to trade, worship, and exchange information. She looked for house servants women with access to their master's food and drink, girls whose positions required them to remain invisible while overhearing crucial conversations. Dinah had been recruited 3 years earlier, during her second year at Magnolia Heights. A coded message delivered by a market vendor led her to a midnight meeting in the Treme district, where Marie Laveau waited with an offer that would change everything. "Your mistress has marked you for suffering," the priestess had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke with spirits and politicians alike. "But suffering can be transformed into power if you have the knowledge to wield it." The lessons came gradually, disguised as traditional healing knowledge. Marie Laveau taught Dinah to identify medicinal plants that could cure or kill, depending on dosage and preparation. Foxglove for heart conditions that could also stop hearts completely. Castor beans for stomach remedies that became deadly ricin when improperly prepared. Oleander for treating skin ailments that transformed into cardiac poison when concentrated. But the most dangerous knowledge wasn't botanical, it was organizational. Marie Laveau had built a network of resistance that operated across racial and class lines. Free people of color provided safe houses. Sympathetic whites offered transportation. Enslaved house servants gathered intelligence and waited for their moment to strike. The priestess never ordered violence, but she prepared her students for the moment when violence might become necessary. Self-defense, she called it, though Louisiana law would never recognize a slave's right to defend herself against her owner's brutality. Justice flows through midnight lessons. Back in Baton Rouge, the investigation was expanding beyond Dinah's individual crime. Dr. Bergeron had begun connecting patterns that terrified Plantation society. 5 mysterious deaths across 3 parishes in the past 2 years, all involving respected families, all preceded by the presence of young female house servants who had subsequently disappeared. The Boudreaux family near Donaldsonville, the Thibault plantation outside Napoleonville, the Arsenault estate in Pointe Coupée Parish. Each death had been attributed to natural causes: heart failure, stomach fever, summer illness. But when Bergeron compared symptoms and timelines, a chilling picture emerged. Someone was systematically targeting Louisiana's most brutal slaveholders, using a network of perfectly placed domestic servants who could strike and vanish before suspicion fell upon them. The deaths looked natural because they were designed to look natural, executed by women who understood both chemistry and strategy. What made the conspiracy even more dangerous was its selectivity. Not every cruel master died mysteriously, only those whose cruelty had crossed particular lines. Marie Rousseau's sexual predation of enslaved children, Boudreaux's habit of selling nursing mothers away from their infants, Thibault's practice of using branding irons to mark runaways. The network was delivering justice that the legal system would never provide, and they were doing it with surgical precision that suggested careful planning and extensive coordination. Marie Laveau had created something unprecedented in the antebellum South, an organization capable of holding slaveholders accountable for their crimes against humanity. But as the manhunt for Dinah intensified, a deeper question emerged. If this network was so sophisticated, why had they allowed Dinah to be exposed? What larger game were they playing? And who would be their next target? Henri Rousseau's study reeked of tobacco smoke and desperate sweat as he paced between mahogany bookshelves lined with leather-bound ledgers. The scratch of his quill against parchment echoed through the room, while outside, search parties combed the bayous with diminishing hope. The weight of silence from his remaining household staff pressed against him like the humid Louisiana air before a hurricane. The master of Magnolia Heights was beginning to understand that his wife's death had exposed secrets far more dangerous than a single runaway slave. Sheriff Thibodeau sat across from Henri's desk, studying plantation records with the methodical attention of a man who had learned to read between carefully written lines. The official books showed a model operation: disciplined slaves, profitable harvests, Christian order maintained through firm but fair treatment. But the sheriff's experience investigating plantation crimes had taught him that official records rarely told the complete story. "Tell me about your wife's relationship with the house servants," Thibodeau said, his pen poised over a notepad that would never see a courtroom. "Any recent conflicts or disciplinary issues?" Henri's hesitation lasted just long enough to be noticed. Evangeline had indeed been harsh with the domestic staff, but Louisiana law gave masters absolute authority over their property. What happened in the slave quarters stayed in the slave quarters, protected by legal codes that classified human beings as livestock with no rights to protection or redress. But Thibodeau was discovering that some secrets couldn't be contained by legal boundaries. From the testimony of Overseer Jacques Boudreau, September 22, 1852, Madame Rousseau was particular about discipline. Sometimes the punishments seemed excessive, even by plantation standards. The breakthrough came when Thibodeau interviewed the youngest house servant, a girl named Félicité who was barely 14. Unlike the older slaves who had perfected the art of strategic silence, Félicité's fear overwhelmed her training. When pressed about Dinah's behavior in the weeks before the poisoning, she revealed details that changed everything. Dinah hadn't been acting alone. The girl described whispered conversations in the servant quarters, coded messages passed during laundry work, and most damning of all, a network of communication that extended far beyond Magnolia Heights. Other plantation house servants had been visiting on market days, carrying more than just gossip between estates. She knew things, Félicité whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. About plants, about other things. Said her grandmother taught her before she died, but that wasn't true. Someone else was teaching her, teaching all of us. The revelation that multiple plantations might be compromised sent panic through Louisiana's planter class. If house servants were coordinating resistance activities, sharing knowledge about poisons and escape routes, then every wealthy family was potentially at risk from the very people who prepared their food and managed their households. Blood runs deeper than loyalty. Dr. Bergeron's investigation had expanded to include autopsies of other mysterious plantation deaths, and his findings painted a terrifying picture of systematic targeting. The victims weren't random. They were specifically chosen based on their treatment of enslaved people, their participation in the domestic slave trade, and their reputation for sexual exploitation of enslaved women and children. Someone was maintaining detailed intelligence on plantation operations across multiple parishes, identifying the worst offenders and marking them for elimination. The precision suggested not just organization, but infiltration at the highest levels of Louisiana society. But the most disturbing discovery came when Bergeron examined Evangeline Rousseau's personal effects. Hidden in her jewelry box, beneath diamond earrings and pearl necklaces, he found letters that revealed the true scope of her cruelty. Correspondence with slave traders discussing the purchase of young girls for domestic purposes. Bills of sale for children as young as 10, separated from their families and sold to buyers whose intentions were clearly predatory. Evangeline hadn't just been a harsh mistress. She had been actively participating in the sexual trafficking of enslaved children, using her position in New Orleans society to facilitate crimes that even some slaveholders found repugnant. The letters also revealed something else. Evangeline had been receiving warnings. Anonymous notes left in her carriage, tucked into her prayer book, slipped under her bedroom door. Someone had been watching her activities, documenting her crimes, and warning her to change her behavior before more direct action became necessary. She had ignored every warning. What would you have done, knowing that the legal system would never hold such a woman accountable for her crimes? Would you have continued hoping for justice that would never come, or would you have taken matters into your own hands, like the network that was systematically hunting Louisiana's most predatory slaveholders? As night fell over Magnolia Heights, Henri Rousseau realized that his wife's death might have been just the beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, people who had been dismissed as property were proving that they possessed both the knowledge and the organization to hold their oppressors accountable, one carefully calculated death at a time. The morning fog rolled off the Mississippi River like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with it the sound of howling bloodhounds and the distant shouts of frustrated searchers. Sheriff Thibodeau stood on the levee outside Baton Rouge, watching his manhunt dissolve into the Louisiana wilderness like sugar in bitter coffee. Dinah had been missing for 8 days, and every lead had evaporated into the maze of bayous and backwaters that protected Louisiana's most dangerous secrets. But the real shock came when Thibodeau received an urgent telegram from New Orleans. Marie Laveau, the infamous voodoo priestess whose network he was only beginning to understand, had been found dead in her home on Ann Street. The cause of death appeared natural heart failure, brought on by her advanced age, but the timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. From the New Orleans Daily Delta, September 24, 1852. The death of Marie Laveau has sent shockwaves through the colored community. Her influence extended far beyond religious practices, touching matters of politics and social justice throughout the region. What authorities didn't yet realize was that Marie Laveau's death had been carefully staged. The legendary priestess had faked her own demise to escape the expanding investigation, using knowledge of cardiac-stopping poisons that her network had perfected over years of careful study. While lawmen searched for a corpse, she was already aboard a steamboat heading upriver, carrying secrets that could destroy Louisiana's plantation system. The fake death also served another purpose. It severed the visible connection between the resistance network and its most famous leader. Without Marie Laveau to blame, investigators would struggle to understand the sophisticated organization that had been operating under their noses for over a decade. Meanwhile, Father Santos received a midnight visitor at St. Joseph's Church. Dinah had returned, but not as the frightened fugitive who had sought sanctuary days earlier. She carried herself with new confidence, bearing information that would reshape the priest's understanding of the conspiracy he had unknowingly joined. "They want me to be captured," Dinah explained, her voice steady in the confessional darkness. "Not executed, captured, alive. There are things I know, names I can reveal, that will bring down the entire network if I'm forced to testify." The revelation chilled Father Santos. The resistance movement had been using Dinah as bait, allowing her to be exposed in order to test the strength of their security systems. If she could evade capture for 2 weeks while every lawman in Louisiana hunted her, then other operatives could feel confident in their own safety. But the strategy carried enormous risks. If Dinah was caught and tortured into revealing names and locations, the entire Underground Railroad operation in Louisiana would collapse. Hundreds of enslaved people who had found freedom through the network would be recaptured. Dozens of free people of color who had provided assistance would face imprisonment or death. Secrets eat their own children. The test was about to intensify. Dr. Bergeron had made a connection that threatened to unravel everything. He had identified a pattern in the timing of mysterious plantation deaths that corresponded exactly with Marie Laveau's known travels throughout Louisiana. If he could prove the voodoo priestess had been personally involved in the poisonings, bounty hunters would track her across the continent. But Bergeron faced his own moral crisis. His investigation had revealed systematic sexual abuse of enslaved children, torture that violated even the loose ethical standards of plantation society, and a legal system that offered no protection to the most vulnerable victims. The more he learned about the dead masters and mistresses, the more he understood why someone might feel justified in taking matters into their own hands. From Dr. Bergeron's private correspondence, September 25, 1852. I am beginning to question whether these deaths represent crimes or justice long delayed. The evidence of abuse is overwhelming, yet our courts will never acknowledge it. The doctor's investigation had uncovered a shadow economy of child trafficking that operated openly in New Orleans slave markets, protected by legal codes that classified human beings as property without rights. Wealthy planters purchased children as young as 8 for purposes that everyone understood, but no one would officially acknowledge. Henri Rousseau's financial records revealed payments to slave traders who specialized in fancy girls, a euphemism for light-skinned children destined for sexual exploitation. His wife, Evangeline, had been a regular customer, using her social connections to identify and purchase specific children who met her twisted criteria. The resistance network hadn't been randomly targeting cruel masters. They had been systematically hunting predators who used their legal ownership of human beings to commit crimes that would have been capital offenses if the victims had been white. But as Dr. Bergeron documented these horrors, he also realized that his investigation was being watched. Someone was tracking his movements, monitoring his correspondence, preparing for the moment when his discoveries might threaten the network's security. The question was no longer whether Dinah would be captured, but whether she would be silenced before she could reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had brought justice to Louisiana's most predatory slaveholders, one carefully calculated death at a time. The courthouse bell in Baton Rouge tolled 11 times as Sheriff Thibodeau received the telegram that would change everything. The scratchy handwriting on yellow paper carried news from New Orleans that made his blood run cold. Marie Laveau's body had vanished from the morgue during the night, leaving behind only an empty coffin and the lingering scent of graveyard dirt. Either the most powerful voodoo priestess in Louisiana had risen from the dead, or someone had orchestrated the most audacious deception in the region's history. The fake death had served its purpose perfectly, while authorities focused on a non-existent corpse. The real Marie Laveau was establishing a new identity 200 miles upriver, but her disappearance created a power vacuum that threatened to expose the entire resistance network she had spent decades building. Without their leader's guiding hand, individual cells began making desperate decisions. 3 plantation houses in different parishes reported attempted poisonings within 48 hours of Marie Laveau's supposed death. Unlike Dinah's carefully calculated strike against Evangeline Rousseau, these attempts were clumsy, obvious, and quickly discovered. The amateur poisoners were caught, tortured, and executed within days. Under brutal interrogation, they revealed fragments of the network's structure: safe houses in New Orleans, coded communication systems, and most dangerously, the names of other operatives still at large. From the Baton Rouge Gazette, September 26, 1852. Mass arrests of suspected conspirators continue across the sugar parishes. Authorities report uncovering an extensive network of slave rebellion extending from New Orleans to Natchitoches. Dr. Bergeron watched the crackdown with growing horror. His investigation had provided the evidence that triggered the witch hunt now consuming Louisiana's enslaved population. Plantation owners were conducting their own trials, dispensing summary justice without bothering with legal formalities. The death toll was climbing toward 100, and most of the victims had never been involved in any resistance activities. The doctor faced an impossible choice. He could remain silent and watch innocent people die, or he could speak publicly about the systematic abuse that had driven the resistance movement and guarantee his own destruction in the process. But his decision was made for him when he returned to his office to find Dinah waiting in his examination room. She had aged years in the past week, her face carrying the weight of knowledge that no 18-year-old should possess. The network had finally decided that her capture was inevitable, and they wanted her to surrender on their terms, rather than face the torture that awaited captured conspirators. "I want to confess," she said simply, "but not to the crimes they think I committed. Vengeance devours its architects." Dinah's true confession revealed the scope of horrors that had motivated the resistance network. She described witnessing the rape of enslaved children as young as 10, forced to watch while masters and overseers violated girls who had no legal protection and no hope of justice. She detailed the sale of nursing mothers away from their infants, the branding of runaways with hot irons, the systematic starvation used to break rebellious spirits. But most shocking of all, she revealed that the resistance network had been documenting these crimes for over a decade. Hidden throughout Louisiana were detailed records of every abuse, every crime, every violation of human dignity committed by the planter class. Names, dates, locations, witnesses, evidence that could destroy dozens of the state's most prominent families if it ever reached sympathetic courts. The poisonings had never been random acts of revenge. They had been surgical strikes designed to eliminate the worst predators while sending a message that even absolute power had limits. The network had been conducting its own trials, gathering evidence, offering warnings to change behavior, and executing judgments when those warnings were ignored. Dr. Bergeron realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in American history. Enslaved people had created their own system of justice, complete with investigation, trial, and punishment phases. They had established moral authority that transcended legal boundaries, holding their oppressors accountable for crimes that the official legal system would never acknowledge. But the network's greatest weapon was also its greatest vulnerability. The documentation that proved systematic abuse could also identify every person who had risked their lives to gather that evidence. If those records fell into the wrong hands, the retaliation would be swift and merciless. As Dinah prepared to surrender herself to certain execution, she carried one final message from the disbanded network. The records had been hidden in locations that only Marie Laveau knew, and the legendary priestess had disappeared into the American wilderness with secrets that could reshape the nation's understanding of slavery's true nature. The question was no longer whether justice had been served, but whether the price of that justice paid in blood by both oppressors and the oppressed had been worth the temporary victory against a system that seemed too powerful to defeat. The gallows stood ready in the Baton Rouge town square as dawn broke on October 1st, 1852. The rough-hewn timber creaked in the morning breeze, while hundreds of spectators gathered to witness what authorities promised would be the final chapter in Louisiana's most notorious slave rebellion. The smell of fresh sawdust mixed with the acrid smoke from breakfast fires and the metallic taste of anticipated violence. Dinah walked to her execution with the dignity of someone who had already won a war that others were still fighting. Sheriff Thibodeau read the charges in a voice that carried across the silent crowd. Murder, conspiracy, inciting rebellion, and crimes against the natural order of Christian society. But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them, because everyone present understood that this execution was about fear, not justice. The real story had emerged during Dinah's brief trial, though most of it would never appear in official records. Dr. Bergeron's testimony revealed systematic abuse that shocked even hardened plantation owners. Evidence of child trafficking, sexual exploitation, and torture that violated every principle of Christian morality that slaveholders claimed to uphold. But the legal system had no mechanism for processing these revelations. Slaves remained property under Louisiana law, incapable of being wronged by their owners. Dinah's detailed confession about witnessing the rape of children, the sale of nursing mothers, and the deliberate starvation of rebellious slaves was ruled inadmissible because enslaved people could not testify against white citizens. From the final court record, September 30th, 1852, the defendant's claims of provocation are irrelevant to the charge of murder. Property cannot claim self-defense against its lawful owner. As the noose was placed around Dinah's neck, she spoke her final words to the assembled crowd. Her voice carried clearly across the square, ensuring that every witness would remember what they had heard, whether they wanted to or not. I poisoned Evangeline Rousseau because she was a monster who bought children to feed her appetites. I would do it again tomorrow if God granted me the chance. The only crime here is that such monsters were allowed to operate under protection of your laws. The trapdoor opened at exactly 8:37 in the morning, but Dinah's words continued echoing long after her body stopped swinging. Blood waters tomorrow's seeds. The execution was meant to restore order, but it accomplished the opposite. Within weeks, plantation houses across Louisiana reported strange incidents, meals that tasted bitter, servants who disappeared without warning, and an atmosphere of suspicion that poisoned relationships between masters and the enslaved people who prepared their food and managed their households. Marie Laveau had vanished completely, but her network's influence had spread beyond her control. The techniques she had taught, the organizational methods she had established, and most importantly, the moral framework she had created for justified resistance. All of these had taken root in communities throughout the South. Dr. Bergeron spent his remaining years documenting the systematic abuse he had uncovered, creating a secret archive of evidence that would eventually find its way to abolitionists in the North. His records provided crucial ammunition for the growing movement to end slavery, proving that the institution corrupted not just the enslaved, but their enslavers as well. But the most lasting impact came from the stories that spread beyond official records. In slave quarters from Virginia to Texas, people whispered about the girl who had poisoned her mistress and died without apologies. Her example inspired others to resist, to organize, and to understand that even absolute power had vulnerabilities that knowledge and courage could exploit. Henri Rousseau died of a heart attack 3 months after his wife's murder, alone in his study, surrounded by ledgers that recorded the purchase and sale of human beings. The remaining slaves at Magnolia Heights were sold at auction, scattered across the Deep South, carrying with them the memory of what resistance could accomplish. The plantation house itself stood empty for over a decade before new owners finally moved in. But servants never stayed long at Magnolia Heights. They reported strange incidents, food that spoiled mysteriously, the lingering scent of bitter almonds, and an oppressive atmosphere that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. Some claimed they could still hear Evangeline Rousseau's screams echoing through the halls on anniversary nights, while others swore they had glimpsed a young woman in-house, servants' clothing moving through the shadows, carrying what looked like a wine goblet that glowed with an otherworldly light. Local folklore insists that Dinah's spirit never left Magnolia Heights, that she continues her work of justice from beyond the grave, ensuring that no one who commits crimes against the innocent will ever feel truly safe within those walls. Even today, visitors to the restored Plantation Museum report unexplained incidents, bitter tastes in their mouths, sudden chills in the dining room, and the distinct feeling of being watched by someone who remembers every injustice ever committed within those walls. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.